Belo Horizonte, Brazil, July the 8th, 2014. 60,000 people fill a stadium the government built specifically for this moment. They are wearing yellow, the color of their flag, the color of their religion, and they are absolutely certain of what is about to happen. Brazil is playing Germany in the semifinal of the World Cup, on Brazilian soil, in Brazilian heat, with a Brazilian crowd so loud the concrete trembles. They have never lost a World Cup match at home, not once. The players walk out of the tunnel and the singing begins, a sound like a country breathing in before it speaks. 29 minutes later, Brazil is losing 5-0. 31 minutes after that, it is 7-1, and the country, not just the football team, the country, will never quite be the same again. That is not a metaphor. That is the documented political, economic, and psychological record of what followed. The question worth asking is not how a football match ended in humiliation. The question is why the humiliation went so deep, so fast, into a society that should have been able to absorb a bad result. Because when you pull back and look at what Brazil actually was in 2014, not the myth, but the reality beneath it, the 7-1 was not an accident. It was the moment a very specific kind of lie ran out of time. To understand the fall, you first need the height. Brazil is not simply a football country, it is the football country. 5 World Cup titles, more than anyone else on earth. The only team to qualify for every World Cup ever held. The inventors of what commentators call Joga Bonito, a Portuguese phrase meaning beautiful game. A style that became so associated with Brazilian identity that the sport and the nation fused in the public imagination, at home and abroad. When people picture Brazil, they picture the yellow shirt. When they picture the yellow shirt, they picture winning. The connection is old, deep, almost sacred. Pelé, acknowledged globally as one of the greatest players who ever lived, once said that football is not simply a sport in Brazil, it is a passion of the people. And the Brazilian government heard that sentence and filed it away. For generations, across different parties, different eras, different crises, the same political logic repeated. When the economy falters, when the inequality screams, when the streets threaten to fill, there is always football. There is always the yellow shirt. There is always a victory around the corner to remind everyone who they are. For a long time, it worked. That is the story in the highlight reels. The archives tell a different one. By 2013, Brazil was fracturing. The economy that had seemed unstoppable in the previous decade was slowing. Inflation was climbing. Public services, hospitals, schools, buses were visibly deteriorating in ways the middle class could no longer ignore. And the government of President Dilma Rousseff had just announced the final cost of preparing for the World Cup it was hosting the following summer. Billions of reais. Stadiums in cities with almost no professional football culture. A new arena in Manaus, in the middle of the Amazon rainforest, built at extraordinary cost for a tournament that would use it 4 times and then leave. When you converted the spending into a number that could be felt, it landed like a punch. More public money than Brazil had spent on education infrastructure in the previous decade, directed into venues that critics called monuments to vanity. The protests began in June 2013 during the Confederations Cup, a warm-up tournament FIFA runs the year before a World Cup, hosted by the host nation. Hundreds of thousands of Brazilians took to the streets, in São Paulo, in Rio, in Brasilia. The chant that became a slogan was in Portuguese, but its meaning crossed every border. There will be no cup. Not like this. Not when a bus ticket costs more than a working family can bear, and the government is building glass and steel football temples. Dilma Rousseff addressed the nation. She promised investment in public services. She promised the protests had been heard. The stadiums kept being built. When the World Cup actually opened in June of 2014, the president of Brazil walked out to open the tournament on home soil. An extraordinary political moment, the symbolic crowning of years of planning. And the crowd booed her, live, on global television, in front of every nation watching. That sound, that booing, is the thing that explains everything that came after. The government had bet that a successful World Cup, and above all, a Brazilian victory in it, would wash all of this away. Football nationalism as political currency, the yellow shirt as the great unifier. This was not a new idea, and it was not a cynical secret. It was simply how things had always worked. But the country had changed faster than the logic keeping up with it. The middle class that now had smartphones and social media was the same middle class that had grown up in the old system, and they were done. Brazil's actual football campaign in 2014 was, by their standards, unconvincing. They scraped through the group stage. They needed a penalty shootout to beat Chile in the round of 16. They needed extra time to beat Colombia in the quarterfinals. And in that Colombia match, in the dying minutes, their best player, the one the whole national project had been built around, was struck from behind by a Colombian defender. Neymar, then 22 years old, the face of the tournament and the face of Brazilian football, fractured a vertebra in his spine and was carried from the pitch on a stretcher, crying. Brazil would face Germany in the semi-final without him. They would also be without their captain, Thiago Silva, suspended after an accumulation of yellow cards. Two of the most important players in the squad, gone, before the biggest match the country had played in a generation. The government said nothing aloud. They didn't need to. The implication was everywhere. Brazil would win anyway. Brazil always found a way. The yellow shirt was the magic. The crowd would carry them. July the 8th, Estádio Mineirão, Belo Horizonte. The city is 45 minutes by air from Rio, and it sits in the state of Minas Gerais, a place with its own deep history of political upheaval, its own long memory of being told what to celebrate. The stadium holds slightly over 60,000. It was full. Germany scored in the 11th minute, a Thomas Müller header from a corner. The crowd was shaken, but not silent. Brazil had been behind before. Then, in a span of 6 minutes, between the 23rd and 29th minute of the first half, Germany scored 4 more times. 4 goals, 6 minutes. The mathematics are so stark, they still feel unreal. Müller again, then Klose, then Kroos, then Kroos again. The crowd did not boo. They did not scream. They went silent in a way that footage from that day captures with terrible clarity. 60,000 people making almost no sound at all, standing in yellow shirts in the afternoon sun, staring at a scoreboard that said 5-0. Some of them were crying. Some were already leaving. Some simply sat down as if their legs had stopped working. Halftime, 5-0. In the second half, Germany scored twice more. Schürrle, coming on as a substitute, added 2 in 11 minutes. Brazil's Oscar scored in the final moments. A consolation goal, the saddest kind, and the match ended 7-1. It is still the largest defeat in Brazilian football history. It is the worst result of any semifinal in World Cup history. Germany had scored more goals against Brazil in one match than any opponent had managed in any World Cup game before. The technical explanations are real and worth acknowledging. Brazil played without their 2 most important players. Germany were an exceptional unit, organized, clinical, and about to win the whole tournament. The Brazilian coach had built his system entirely around Neymar, and without him, there was no system. These things are true, but they are not why July the 8th, 2014 hollowed out something in the Brazilian national psyche in a way that a football defeat, even a bad one, does not normally do. It went deeper than football, because the football had been made to carry more than football can hold. For a year, the government had implicitly promised that the World Cup would vindicate the spending, the disruption, the displacement of communities around stadium construction sites, the billions that did not go to hospitals. The yellow shirt would make it worthwhile. When Brazil lifted the trophy, on Brazilian soil, at the Maracanã in Rio, completing a story the whole country had been sold, the protests would feel like a bad dream. People would remember where they were when it happened. The political logic was as old as the sport itself. When Germany scored 4 goals in 6 minutes, the logic collapsed. Not because Brazil lost, because everyone watching suddenly understood that no outcome on a football pitch could answer the questions being asked in the streets. The stadium in the Amazon would still be empty on Monday. The buses would still be expensive. The hospitals would still be short of staff. Football had been the answer, and in Belo Horizonte, on a Tuesday afternoon, in 6 minutes, it ran out of answers. If this is changing how you see the World Cup, hit like. It tells us to keep digging, because what happened next was never supposed to become public the way it did. What happened next was not a football story at all. In the days after the semi-final, with Brazil having lost to the Netherlands in the third-place match as well, finishing in 4th place at a World Cup they hosted, a conversation began in Brazil that football could no longer delay. The cost of the tournament. The stadiums that were already being called white elephants, beautiful, expensive, and useless in cities that didn't have the population or the professional football infrastructure to fill them. The total price. The communities that had been moved, the money that had flowed through construction contracts that were, at the time, only beginning to be examined. Within 18 months of the World Cup final, Brazilian federal investigators had begun one of the largest corruption investigations in history. What became known internationally as Operation Car Wash, a sprawling inquiry into bribery, kickbacks, and money laundering that eventually touched the state oil company, the construction industry, and nearly every major political party in the country, had its origins in the same economic and political system that built those stadiums. The investigation ultimately reached the presidency itself. Dilma Rousseff was impeached in 2016, though on charges related to government accounting practices rather than the construction scandals. The former president who preceded her, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, was convicted of corruption and spent time in prison before those convictions were later overturned on procedural grounds by the Supreme Court. None of this was caused by a football match, but the match cracked the surface through which all of it became visible. When the yellow shirt stopped working as political armor, when it lay in the dirt of Mineirão, 7 goals down, with fans weeping in the stands, Brazil had no more magic trick. The story the government had been telling, and that most of the country had been choosing to believe, had nowhere left to go. The players were shaken in ways that took years to articulate. David Luiz, the defender who had scored against Colombia in the quarterfinal and wept after it, a moment of joy and release that the cameras couldn't get enough of. That same David Luiz, 12 days later, was on the pitch for all 7 goals. Photographs of Brazilian players kneeling, heads down, jerseys pulled over their faces, circulated around the world. They have been printed in newspapers, included in exhibitions, referenced in academic papers about collective trauma. A country of 200 million people had been watching, and the image that came back to them was their own team unable to look up. One documented detail from that night stays with you. After the final whistle, after the Germany celebrations, a handful of Brazilian supporters remained in the Mineirão long after the stadium emptied. Security staff found them sitting in silence in the upper tier, looking at the pitch. No one asked them to leave immediately. Nobody took a photograph of them that ended up famous. They were just people sitting in a stadium that had cost a small city's budget to build, looking at something that wasn't there anymore. That is the story that doesn't make the highlight reel. The highlight reel shows the 7 goals, the German celebration, the scoreboard. It does not show the decision that was made, years before July the 8th, to build a nation's self-image on top of a sport, to wire the pride of 200 million people into the outcome of 11 men on a rectangle of grass, to make a trophy the answer to questions that trophies cannot answer. The 7-1 was not a football failure. It was the moment that logic became visible, publicly, to everyone at once. Brazil's football did not disappear after 2014. The team kept qualifying. Neymar returned from his injury. The yellow shirts kept selling. But something in the relationship between the country and its football changed permanently. The magical thinking, the certainty that Brazil was destined to win, that the sport was a kind of national inheritance rather than a contest, became harder to maintain. Brazil have not won a World Cup since 2002. They have entered every subsequent tournament as favorites and exited in circumstances that felt, each time, like a new variation on the same wound. The quarterfinal exit in 2022 against Croatia on penalties. The tears, the disbelief. The mechanism, once you see it, is hard to unsee. Football greatness takes decades to build and seconds to reveal as fragile. Governments that tie their legitimacy to sporting outcomes are making a bet on something they cannot control. When the bet pays off, it is called national pride. When it doesn't, the bill falls not on the government, but on the people who believed. The 60,000 in yellow, the tens of millions watching, the families gathered around screens in cities whose hospitals were built to a lower standard than the stadiums that hosted strangers for a month. Now, the World Cup is here. In North America, across 3 countries, in cities that are hosting it for the first time or for the first time in a generation. New stadiums, new infrastructure, billions spent. And Brazil is in this tournament, wearing yellow, carrying history on their back. They arrive not as favorites, but as a team still in the process of defining what comes after the old story. The players in the squad now were children in 2014. Some of them watched that match on television and decided, watching it, that they would spend their lives making sure it never happened again. The question is whether any of them, or any government, or any football federation, or any host city, has actually learned the thing the 7-1 had to teach. Not a tactical lesson, not a question of squad selection or formation. The deeper question: what happens when you give a game the job of holding a nation together? What happens when the game refuses? Belo Horizonte is still there. The Mineirão is still there. The scoreboard that read 7-1 is gone, replaced by new ones, new matches, new numbers. But the question that stadium asked in 2014 about what football is actually for and what it costs when it is asked to be something bigger than a game, that question is still open. It may still be the most important question the World Cup has ever asked.